For thousands of years, the waters of Lough Ree have been both a lifeline and a battlefield. From the earliest log boats to sleek warships, this lake has carried stories of survival, trade, conflict and faith. You need only look at the ruined castles and the weathered stone walls along its shores to know that the lake has always been at the heart of Irish history in this area. In this episode, we're exploring how Lough Ree's waters shape life on its shores and islands, and how the evidence that remains tells us of that turbulent past. When the very first people arrived in Ireland about 10,000 years ago, they found a land covered in forest, tough going for large groups to get through. So rivers and lakes offered an easier way to travel.
In times past, when we have a world that's more heavily wooded and to a much greater degree, your rivers are your conduits through the world. Your rivers are your motorways, in a sense.
Prehistoric finds are found along the river. Log boats have been found. We know that both Mesolithic and Neolithic people used the rivers. We have evidence of them fishing, particularly for salmon. So in prehistory, in other words, from the Mesolithic, we'll say 6,000, 7,000 BC onwards, the river is being used.
The arrival of the Celts in the Irish Iron Age brought with it long decades of wars, disputes and dispossession. And into this dangerous world came a new force, Christianity. By the 6th century, monks and hermits began settling the islands, leaving behind the ruins we see today. Far from being isolated, these communities were connected. Supplies and imports travelled up the Shannon, and when great centres of learning like Clonmacnoise emerged, students arrived from abroad, bringing trade goods like wine and fine ceramics with them.
Ireland would have been largely, from a settlement point of view, very dispersed. So you're talking about outside of hubs of activity at the likes of Clonmacnoise or the island monasteries on Lough Ree, for instance, or indeed Roscommon is a great monastic town in its own right. These are your places of semi-urban or proto-urban activity. So they're not truly a town, but they're not too far off. The wider countryside, the rural countryside, is populated with one-off landholdings in the form largely of ring forts, and they would have had a landholding attached to them, and that's where the largest portion of the population were residing. So your religious houses are very prominent within the landscape as well. You can imagine the likes of the round towers. There would have been a round tower at Roscommon. We know of the round towers obviously at Clonmacnoise and places like that, and they are focal points. They are nearly like lightning rods in order to provide a kind of a route of approach, a place of congregation, a way of maybe making money as well. And that's the kind of the juxtaposition between the secular, I suppose, and the religious and what goes alongside that.
So it's little wonder that in 845 AD, the Vikings came up the Shannon to attack.
People often say, well, surely they couldn't have rowed or sailed up the Shannon. There would have been fords and things like that. Well, that is no problem. Well, we have historical references to portages. Like, for example, we have a very famous one, I think in the 1290s, of the O'Flahertys portaging their boats, not just one boat, from Lough Corrib across to Killary and then raiding up into Clew Bay. So portage, did actually occur.
And then certainly there's well attested evidence that about the middle of 937-ish, but for around 10 years they were, you could speak of a virtual Viking occupation of the lake.
I mean, we have references to a Viking fleet in the 9th and 10th century on Lough Ree. There is a reference to a Viking Longford or ship fortress. Nobody's really properly understood where that is. It's been argued that it's Rindoon. Well, we won't really know until if one day, money becomes available and the landowner is happy to possibly excavate Rindoon.
Outside of their major centres such as Dublin and Waterford, the evidence of a Viking presence is hard to find. We largely depend on the writings of the time or treasure that might have been found.
They're nearly invisible on the landscape. If you think about an encampment, a large body of Viking warriors and the retainers, it's a whole series of tents. There may be a ditch dug in order to kind of encase that, but there's no evidence really on the landscape for that today. So what you'd be looking for really is you'd be looking for the likes of hoards of silver that might have been left in deposits in certain locations for safekeeping.
One of the largest Viking gold hoards ever to turn up in Western Europe turned up on Hare Island or Inisherin about 1800. Sadly it was melted down, but not before drawings were done of it.
The Vikings' dominance in Ireland was finally finished after the Battle of Clontarf in 1014. A mere 160 years later, with the assistance of both Dermot MacMorrow and the Irish Church, the Normans under Strongbow invaded Ireland.
Yeah, so Anglo-Normans are starting to knock on the door of Connacht in the first half of the 13th century, really, and that initially comes in the form of producing earthwork castles. So they're not using greenfield sites either. They're using sites that are more likely than not to be Gaelic occupied in the time before. So if we look at the locality, we know Athlone is a place of residence for the O'Kellys and then the O'Connors, 12th century, 11th and 12th centuries in particular. So the Anglo-Normans come and they occupy that. Why? Because it's location. It's a strategic spot on the River Shannon, a key point for tax and tariff and tolls through the landscape. Your next point of major, I suppose, effort is in the form of Rindoon. It's not a place that's a greenfield site. It's a peninsula out onto Lough Ree, but there are arguments to suggest that that might have been the site of an O'Connor residence, a Longford perhaps.
That's called safe harbour, and the prevailing wind in this area is southwesterly. So if there's a very strong gale, it'll come from the southwest. So in here is a sheltered harbour. Now they found remnants of some boats and also the slipway where they would pull in the boats at the time.
It's an Anglo-Norman town. It's got walls, it's got a hospital, it's got a castle. You can still see the remains of some houses. It's got a parish church. There may have been a deer park there. I would think that Rindoon and Athlone, which is another Anglo-Norman settlement in the 13th century and early 14th century, is actually trading with Gaelic settlements further up the Shannon system. I've often thought of that marketplace because we know from the historical sources that there was a Welsh garrison. Certainly the constable of the castle is of Anglo-Norman origin. You then would have had the Irish coming in to trade, both the Irish elite, the local Irish elite, O'Kellys, O'Connors, McDermotts. You then had from what we can see, mostly Middle English speaking townsmen. It's funny in a way because we don't think of that sort of diversity. You know, we think that's a modern thing, but it was obviously there in medieval times as well.
When people knock down something in the way they would talk about it, they tumbled it. But we don't know who tumbled this down when it happened. We don't know whether it fell down naturally or whether it was tumbled by the Irish.
And this is the largest deserted medieval village in the British Isles, certainly if not in Europe. And that is a massive exemplar of the type of efforts, revenue being inputted into Eastern Connacht as a way of trying to supercharge the Anglo-Norman experiment in Eastern Connacht.
Roscommon Castle is the third of the great Norman royal castles on Lough Ree, built in 1269. Keeping these castles supplied was a problem, surrounded as they were by Gaelic clans intent on getting them out.
But the ways in which they're being populated, supplied with troops, supplied with all that's required to keep these places running is probably using the thoroughfare of the river as opposed to overland.
Excavations show how the Normans relied on imported pottery, iron tools and trade goods shipped via the Shannon into Lough Ree. And unlike the Vikings who lived by raiding and tribute, the Normans built a system of markets, tolls and fisheries that regularised trade. That trade depended on the castles and the control of the two major pinch points, Athlone and Lanesborough.
Lanesborough's original name was Athleague, and I know there's another Athleague, but its original name was Athleague, and they still call the west side Ballyleague, okay. And Athlone is Ahaluan, and Ath is a ford, of course. So they were both the fording points, as you say, at either end of the lake. And so there was a succession of fortresses of one sort or another at Athlone and at Lanesborough, which don't really survive. But they do at Athlone, and Athlone is still a major military centre. So
I mean, these are pinch points. These are they're like a dam in a sense, and we think about it as a dam for money making as opposed to for the throughput of water per se. So you can't really pass through here unless you pay your dues.
We also hear of a naval galley being stationed at Rindoon to stop raiding, Gaelic raiding down the Shannon.
Efforts at settlement ultimately foundered, and the whole venture only lasted about a century.
Moving forward to the 1650s, and Cromwell's invasion brought another great upheaval. Vast areas of land around Lough Ree were confiscated from Catholic landowners and redistributed to soldiers and creditors. The lake once again became a key transport route, carrying timber, grain, cattle and hides from the seized estates to markets downstream. Garrisons at Athlone, Rindoon and Roscommon depended on the river supply lines as the British settled in.
Well, we know, well, I mean, as I say, we have, references to boats coming up from Athlone, and, it's 17th century when, loads of boats coming up and down the lake.
Garrisons at Athlone, Rindoon and Roscommon depended on the river supply lines as the British settled in. Records of ferries and fisheries, leases, tolls and disputes show that the Shannon's economic role provisioning armies, exploiting fisheries and transporting bulk goods for the new landowners. By the 1700s, the British government saw that the Shannon waterway was an important trading asset. The Irish Parliament funded works to clear shoals and improve navigation, and in 1755 the Commissioners of Inland Navigation began building canals, locks and lockhouses to enhance the access to the waterway.
There were several obstructions to navigation on the river, which I suppose the Vikings carried their boats around, and others had to carry their cargoes around and things. And this was overcome in a sort of way by a man called Thomas Omer, an engineer in the mid-18th century. And Omer's solution, if he came to an obstruction, was to build a little canal around it. It didn't do much for commerce on Lough Ree because The Royal Canal and the Grand Canal were built subsequently, and so the Grand Canal cargoes came up as far as Athlone and down as far as Limerick. The Royal Canal cargoes came down as far as Lanesborough and then up as far as Carrick-on-Shannon and so on. So Lough Ree was in the middle, and there was very little commercial navigation on the lake. So it fell into considerable decay. Then along came the Shannon Commissioners in the 1830s and 1840s with a great engineer named Thomas Rhodes. And Rhodes was, a typical Victorian engineer. He believed he could do anything. So once Rhodes got the money, he drove a new navigation system, bypassed Omer's works, and just if he met an obstruction, he dredged it. And he did the same at Lanesborough and changed the navigation there as well to improve it, and bypassed, did the same job at Tarmanbarry and so on. But Rhodes was a brilliant engineer, absolutely, and he knew it. If you look at his works, he's in cast iron on the winches.
By 1831, the results were clear. Paddle steamers carried nearly 15,000 passengers and moved over 36,000 tonnes of freight.
The slow improvement in the road networks, the arrival of railways, takes a lot of the heavy cargo that the river would have held and been burdened by and been able to move away from the watery place.
It starts with the coming of the railways, really. I mean, that brings numbers of travellers, and the railway companies maintain steamers on the Shannon. There was scarcely any boating on the Shannon, scarcely any. And CIE then put two boats on the Shannon to carry passengers, the St. Brendan and the St. Kieran.
When I made my first communion, I was brought off on either the St. Brendan or the St. Kieran. One of these boats that came in, they were CIE boats, and they plied the Shannon here at Athlone. And I certainly was brought off in those. And again, that's about 1962 or 63 as well. But we didn't have a boat ourselves, and it was much later. I would have been an adult before I had the opportunity to go on boats on the river.
And so by then, private boating was getting going, and it's now at a huge stage, of course.
This type of boating that we're at here now, it's really only in my lifetime that's blossomed. The big boats that were on the Shannon before that were there, but they were owned by gentry and that side of life. But the normal, ordinary boating took over in my lifetime, sort of thing. And we had some moorings out that people would row out in the dinghy out to the mooring, out to the boat moored, and come in. And then there was more. That was growing a little bit each year, and there was inquiries then about maybe have a jetty and something that make it easier for them, and that's it built up and built up and built up from that.
So for us as 21st century historians, archaeologists, looking back in time, we have to be really clear on the fact that just because we don't see it like an M50 now, that's all gone. It's much more static, it's a more silent place now. And that's the thing we need to always remember when we look at places like Lough Ree or Lough Derg as well. And they're all examples of where the river was a vital artery for everything we need.
Imagine the monks threading land dots with their prayer needles before the hammer and tongs of Odin's fury. Or imagine again remnants of Norman blocks, half hid, a felled fortress with only ghosts whispering hearsays through the trees. Imagine then a watery highway, Cattle, hides, wood, wine, and Omar's solution to cut into the land's flesh wherever there's obstruction. I can imagine them all, their many tongues, Gaelic, Latin, Norse, French, twisted roots of wrangled English, trying to grapple with the power of passage. Can you imagine the watery road resurrected in a future beyond asphalt, travel and commerce, going back to the threaded tapestry and a prayer to the water's goddess for safe passage?